Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of the United States and the Cold War. In the previous lecture, I traced some of the deep background origins of the Cold War in the centuries leading up to the 20th century itself. And we concluded with some reflections on the Bolshevik Revolution and its outcomes. In this lecture, I'll continue talking about the origins of the Cold War, leading up to the years just before World War II. The United States in the early 20th century was a nation already simmering with deep anti-immigrant and anti-foreign sentiment. So they needed little excuse to fear and hate the Russians, as they did most other foreigners, and particularly the groups known as the so-called new immigrants that were flooding into the country in huge numbers in the 1880s and 1890s. So World War I only heeded those sentiments, as there was an intense propaganda campaign on the home front that both increased patriotism during the war and chipped away at foreign interest, particularly German during the war years. There was a group created under the Woodrow Wilson administration called the Committee on Public Information, the CPI, which was headed by George Creel, a Mississippi newspaperman who was very good at understanding public sentiments from his background in advertising with the newspaper. This group was tasked with winning over public support and opinion behind the war, which Woodrow Wilson had actually kept the United States out of and campaigned against during his re-election campaign in 1916. But as the United States came to be involved in the war, Wilson felt it was important to win over public opinion, and so the CPI and George Creel went about their business. The group handed out flyers, made posters, and gave presentations explaining and promoting United States involvement in the war. These were the so-called 4-Minute Men, who traveled the country giving speeches in lecture halls and theaters of 4 minutes or so, explaining why the United States had joined the war. But the CPI also had a darker side, condemning all things German, banning the music of Wagner, assembling lists of suspected traitors, and so on. And so during the war, there is this intense anti-immigrant and particularly anti-German sentiment in the country. After the war, this intense patriotism did not die down quickly or easily, and the intense anti-foreign sentiment didn't die down either. It simply needed a new target, and that came to be the communists, whom, as I've described, Americans already feared and distrusted for the reasons I talked about in the last lecture. And so in the aftermath of World War I, 1919 became the year of the first Red Scare. There were strikes and bombings. An anarchist feeling was in the air. The government launched investigations, deported many, attacked laborers and labor unions, and crushed strikes. Ultimately, the Red Scare died down, but suspicions about foreigners and particularly communists lingered well into the 1920s. While the Red Scare eventually died down, American relations with Russia were still sketchy during the 1920s. American presidents throughout the 1920s followed the example of Woodrow Wilson and did not formally recognize the Soviet government. Thus, there were no official relations and discussions between the two sides. The United States did send aid to the war-ravaged Russia in the early 1920s, totaling about $60 million. And some American businesses began to do business in Russia, including General Motors and the Ford Motor Company. American agricultural and industrial equipment became staples in Russia. Some hoped that infusing elements of our capitalist system might weaken or perhaps even overcome communism. Still, the United States didn't even establish formal relations with the new Soviet government until 1933. When Franklin Roosevelt took office in 1933, the United States had bottomed out in the Great Depression. It was evident that non-recognition of Russia had not served any great purpose, and we were desperate for trading partners and any economic help during the Depression. And American politics were moving increasingly to the left, and so while the United States never openly welcomed socialist ideas, there were many in the United States who called for more acceptance of leftist ideas, and such policies were reaching a peak during the New Deal and the FDR years. So Roosevelt elected to recognize the Soviet government in 1933 and thereby establish normal diplomatic relations. Stalin hoped that this might equate to assistance in Russia's continuing battles against Japan, but those requests were repeatedly denied. So, despite recognition and FDR's so-called good neighbor policy, which extended to Latin America as well as Russia and other parts of the world, despite some of these gains in terms of positive relations, this was also the era of Stalin's bloody purges, the full extent of which was unknown until after the end of the Cold War, and even at that time, which were shocking enough. This was the era of collectivization of agriculture and famine and death in Russia. Stalin took power in 1924 and installed a ruthless but efficient government. He purged his old rivals, and coupled with our deep-seated fears and suspicions, these events conspired to keep Russia at arm's length, even as we attempted to normalize relations. For its part, the Soviets had plenty of concerns about the West as well. There was lasting Russian mistrust stemming from the landing of Western troops in Soviet Russia in 1918, who became involved, directly and indirectly, in assisting the anti-Bolshevik whites in the Civil War. This helped to solidify lasting suspicions among Soviet leadership of the capitalist world and the West. In 1919, the former World War I allies, Britain, France, and the United States, joined the White Russians to fight off the Bolsheviks following the revolution. Although the intervention failed, and the Red Army of the Bolsheviks ultimately did secure the power of the new Soviet state, the young Soviet government never quite trusted the Western democracies after that. For their part, those Western democracies did not invite the Soviet Union to participate in the World War I peace talks or in the League of Nations. The West also didn't aid the Republicans fighting against fascists during the Spanish Civil War, which the Russians did. The West also didn't invite the Soviets to the Munich Conference in 1938, which decided the fate of Czechoslovakia in the years leading up to World War II, even though the Soviet Union had a security pact with Czechoslovakia. Not long after the Munich Conference, Stalin declared that the West was trying to drive Hitler east into war against the Soviets. So there was plenty of deep-seated mistrust and even dislike between the two sides. So it was only a matter of necessity of World War II that drove the two together into an alliance. So again, I think this discussion demonstrates that those who are wondering how the wartime allies of World War II quickly became rivals The question really was, why did they ever become allies in the first place? It is to that question that I'll turn in the next lecture, when we talk about the nature of the World War II alliance between these two longtime rivals.